All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to what will probably be the first of quite a few shows regarding Irma here on SouthernWeather.com. Tonight we have a couple of special guests. We currently have Levi Cowan from TropicalTidbits.com on. Eric Webb is going to drop by in just a few minutes. So hopefully everybody can get to work. I'll be watching the boards if things aren't working very well. Just a couple of things to start with. We see that we've gotten a couple of donations lately. We appreciate that. And if you have any donation money left, please donate to the Tropical Tidbits. I mean, right now I'm sure that his server is burning up with the amount of traffic he's getting. I mean, I've seen many a times on our site people have posted links to the Tropical Tidbit. So it's a great resource, and we're happy to have him. So anything. But just to get started, like we said, the big talk right now is Irma. So Levi, what over the past few days, what's been your biggest impression with Irma? What have you seen that can help us
What
out?
has been my big what for Irma? Sorry.
What's what's been the big impressions you've had so far? What over the past few days, what have you seen with Irma that could bring concern, or think there's out to sea?
Well, it's uncommonly strong for this part of the basin. It's a Category 4 hurricane. This is kind of a big deal. It's not that common for the Leeward Islands. I think Phil Klotzbach was just posting on Twitter shortly ago about how there's only been 4 hurricanes of this intensity to hit the Leewards in the database, and this could be the 5th one. It's a big deal, and storm surge is going to be a huge impact for low-lying areas, and the winds themselves are strong enough to be very life-threatening if this makes a direct hit, and even a glancing blow could be devastating, considering that the eye-wall replacement cycles the hurricane has been undergoing are causing an expansion of the wind field over time, and that can make the storm bigger and more dangerous over a wider area. So even if it's a glancing blow to the Northern Islands, could be quite bad in some of these areas, and this is really not something to mess with, and it could affect a large amount of land area between here and the end of its life. We're talking about the Leewards, we're talking about Puerto Rico, the Greater Antilles, Hispaniola, Cuba, Bahamas, the Turks and Caicos, and then potentially the United States after that. There's a lot of people in the path here, and so this has potential to be a significant storm at the end of all things.
Yeah, that's one thing I've noticed in all the models. It seems like once it gets north of Puerto Rico and toward the Dominican, it really starts to expand in size. Besides eye-wall replacement cycles, what's the biggest reason for that? I mean, why is the storm going to grow so much as it approaches the United States?
Well, there's some, theoretical debates. Some storms tend to grow over time. A lot of Atlantic storms do naturally grow larger, if not due to eye-wall replacement cycles, then due to natural evolution of the vortex. Very gradually over time, the circulation will expand. Often it has to do with how moist the environment is. Drier environments can tend to limit the size of a storm. The hurricanes in a very moist part of the Southwest Atlantic, they usually tend to get larger, and every eye-wall replacement cycle tends to make it just a little larger still. Whenever one of those occurs. And in model forecast, though, you do have to be careful. Models like the GFS will be realistically large for a variety of reasons. And so often you'll see it grow in the model. It doesn't necessarily grow to that extent in reality, but it probably will grow a little bit here.
Hey, Eric, I see you down there. How you doing?
Hey, doing pretty good. Doing pretty good.
Yeah, welcome to the chat. We've got Levi here, and we're currently online on Southern Weather. So, Levi was just giving his thoughts on, Irma and as it chugs westward towards the United States. So I'll pose the same question to you. What do you think is going to happen over the next few days? And do you think it is a considerable threat to the United States, which I'm assuming the answer is yes, but I figured I'd throw it out there anyway.
I think it is. The biggest question for me, at least to this point, is going to be the interaction with the Greater Antilles. You see in a lot of cases, there's plenty of storms. We had recently as Isaac in 2012, where a storm was initially expected to go on the eastern seaboard, ended up into the central Gulf of Mexico. A lot of interaction with land like that can cause the circulation to get jostled around. And so that's less likely now for, at least I think, for Hispaniola, but definitely for Cuba, that can definitely change the track considerably. That's why I think many of us are still kind of hanging on to maybe this could go into the Gulf of Mexico. But other than that, I think, relatively speaking, this is a very legitimate threat to the United States. I think as Levi mentioned, I got in here as he was talking about the GFS, it has convective parameterization issues where it over deepens really, really strong tropical cyclones. Although, if there's, I guess, any caveat to this is that if this were to, say, get south of about like Nassau or get into the Florida Straits, some of those forecasts getting down to 9, 10 millibars or close to 900 wouldn't be too unrealistic, just given the fact that we have seen storms like that in the past do that. But his earlier predictions weren't very good. So I think it's a really legitimate threat to the United States, for sure. We're probably a couple of days away from really finding out what it's really made of. Once a lot of the upper air data from the NOAA G4 aircraft gets in, and once we're able to sample the short wave that'll be diving out of the Midwest and into the Mid-South, and once we have at least some of the evolution of this trough in the Northeast properly analyzed, I think we'll have a pretty decent idea on where it's going to go.
Yeah, I hate to put either one of you on the spot about what might happen once it gets to the U.S. So we'll kind of table that, and maybe we can get you guys back later this week sometime to discuss this again. Unless either one of you really want to kind of jump out there and say this might happen. And the trough capture that happens across the deep south, is that going to have an effect on will it will it back into the United States if that does occur? And what would we be, as just as weather enthusiasts, what would we be looking for on the models to see that that's going to occur?
Well, I mean, the trends in the models have been substantial in the last couple of days. We've already seen a lot of changes, and that's nothing surprising given the long range at which we've been tracking this storm. We were watching for potential U.S. threats even 10, 12 days in advance, which was at the time was way out there. Now we're getting a little closer, a week from being near the U.S. if it's going to be there. And still at that range, there are some questions. Like Eric mentioned, the shortwave diving down out of the Midwest is sort of a new feature that's been around in the last 48 hours worth of forecasts. And so now we have sort of two troughs to deal with. The main one that comes through New England and erodes the ridge originally and induces the northward turn, but also the shortwave diving down into the south, which could aid the turn. But it also becomes a cutoff flow at that point. And it's kind of a messy, loose flow pattern over the eastern third of the U.S. over the weekend and into next week. And that's pretty bad for predictability. Where's the hurricane at that time? Does it get tangled with the terrain, like Eric said? How far south really is it? Because the models trended so far south just yesterday. I mean, the GFS run from, a day and a half ago was already up into New England at the same time that it now has it on the coast of Cuba. So, I mean, there's been a lot of changes here. It just goes to show you the uncertainty in this kind of a pattern, and folks shouldn't be assuming that a certain scenario is going to come to pass. We're certainly way too soon for that, at least for the U.S.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess if there's one caveat is that it's probably going to end up somewhere between the Central Gulf or just barely out to sea. And one thing I've been noticing is that, say if it interacts with this upper level low, there'll be a lot of shear, especially out of the south. And I've been noticing at least that it starts to undergo extratropical transition, at least unusually far to the south for a storm like this. So if it does get into the southeast United States, or particularly if its inner core gets disrupted, I feel like if it goes over the greater Antilles or interacts with Florida a considerable period of time, I think that transition could be made faster if it interacts with that upper level low. That would be one thing I would put forth. But yeah, we really don't know, at least at this point. I think we're still probably at least 2 or 3 days out from really narrowing down, is it going to go in the Gulf or the Carolinas. But even then, if the storm goes over Cuba, goes over the central mountains, or goes and hugs the coast and then weakens considerably, it's not going to feel the trough as quickly. And that's one of the only problems that I see there. And so then, how does that affect? The greater Antilles are usually the biggest wild card here, and I think that's also going to be the case yet again.
So, I guess another thing we're watching for is the erosion of the Atlantic Ridge and the trough exiting the Northeast. What are we looking for to maybe sneak this out to see? Does the trough need to hang in longer? Does it need to be deeper originally? What's the best way to get this to go out to sea?
Well, my original thought over the last couple of days was the trend toward a faster moving hurricane was good news for the United States, because if you left everything else the same, if the hurricane was going to move faster, it was going to get to the flank of the ridge while the trough was still deep over the eastern U.S., and that was going to increase odds of a curvature. The curveball that's been thrown at us in the last couple of days, at least more so in the GFS than the European, which has been a little more consistent, but even still in that model, we've seen a little more progression from that trough as it comes to the east. And so while the hurricane's coming in faster now, the trough is leaving faster as well. So the two effects have sort of offset in some of the forecasts. And so we're still left with these scenarios where the sharp turn to the north can occur over the continent as opposed to east of the continent. So to get it out to sea, the trough in New England could either be slower to leave, deeper, or the short wave coming down out of the Midwest could be stronger and help kick the thing before it gets to, Florida or Cuba. Either one of those works, and we'll be sampling the ridge with the G4 tonight. The 0Z runs will have some extra data from that ridge just north and northwest of the Eastern Caribbean. So we'll see if that makes any sort of difference or not. It's kind of hard to say there. And we've had, I believe, extra soundings from the Weather Service offices in the eastern and mid part of the country as well, which may help. Doesn't contribute a whole lot in general, so we may not see a lot of major changes. But hopefully we'll have a better idea tomorrow.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think that's just about the only way you're really going to get the storm to go out to sea is if the trough digs deeper. We now have a pretty good idea of what the downstream Rossby wave dispersion is going to look like after the extratropical transition to Sanvu. So the last several days, one thing we've seen is that the models have progressively become less enthused about its interaction with the trough that came off the Kamchatka Peninsula. And so that has caused a lot of effects downstream, and it's allowing the ridge over western North America that's been somewhat quasi-stationary over the course of the summer to now build back in. We're almost getting to that point in the year. Usually when you get closer and closer to these shoulder seasons, you start to see these standing patterns near the summer finally begin to shift as the wavelengths and the forcing shift. And it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves. But that's really one of the big reasons why now there is a threat there because of that. And I think also there could be a contribution from the fact that the background forcing has shifted more towards a Nina-ish background. We had, you remember, of course, the calls were for this El Nino to try to develop maybe later in the summer or in the fall. Of course, historically speaking, after you get a really, really large El Nino event, and you can look back last 200 years, obviously, dynamically speaking, it's not impossible to get another El Nino, but there's a pretty legitimate underlying reason why you don't get at least another El Nino after you have really long and very large events like we saw in 2015-16. And so that forcing shifting into the Eastern Hemisphere, which we had an MJO pulse, you remember, earlier in the month. It's still sort of there, but it's blending in with the background state, so it's moving really slowly. That's another thing, too, that the models have had trouble with is that anytime, especially you get in a Nina background, particularly when the MJO moves into the Eastern Hemisphere where you are superimposed onto the La Nina state, is when you have excess convection going off. That slows down the wave, and the models tend to look at it as a moist convectively coupled Kelvin wave almost, and that causes a lot of speed issues, and that can create a lot of downstream problems in the longer term. But that's also part of the reason I think why this ridge is also starting to erode. And getting a trough that deep too to dig into the eastern United States and remain, I guess, connected into the stream flow and not cut off is pretty hard to do, at least in early September, unless you're in El Nino where you have excess westerly momentum being pushed into the Western Hemisphere. So until we get really late in the month, that's really not something that's feasible. So that's another reason why we're starting to see this cutoff low. Obviously, the short wave will be reinforcing that. So it'll be definitely interesting to see how this goes out. But hopefully, another high-named storm doesn't get retired. We've seemed to have tried to buck that trend of late, and ever since Iris, we've been on the ball in the 2000s, unfortunately.
Yeah. One thing that I've noticed is the hard right turn on the models towards the north. When the ridge erodes and the weakness starts, the storm just shoots almost due north. Is that normal? Is there going to be any kind of westward momentum to carry it a little further west than what the models are showing, or is it going to slow down once the ridge erodes? Is that why we see it almost stop and then due north? Is that kind of what we're looking at here?
Well, it's not that uncommon to see really sharp turns in hurricanes at this latitude. When the ridge is nosing in like that, it's rather zonally oriented, maybe west-southwest to east-northeast across the western Atlantic. And when you have a trough over New England, well, I mean, the flow has got to be southwest to northeast pretty quickly as you move north of 30. So to have the hurricane approaching on the southern flank of the same ridge, well, the path around the ridge is a really sharp turn. To get the hurricane to go due north, you need the ridge to either build back in as the trough exits in its wake, or you need to have the anticyclonic wave break that's coming behind the trough build in to New England. The hurricane still far enough south that that ridge begins to influence the hurricane and then push it north, northwest, or northwest inland over the northeast United States. That's the way it could avoid turning sharply and come farther inland, as if that ridge comes into play later. And that's still highly unclear, though a lot of ensemble tracks actually do show a pretty north track into the northeast part of the country in the very long term. Of course, we're talking about far too in advance to really know, but that sort of general scenario is possible along with the sharp hook to the right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty unusual to see a turn like that, at least this early in the season. You typically look, I mean, obviously October, as far as hurricane tracks goes, often anything but typical, as we've seen with Matthew and, Hazel and things like that. I think it definitely will be interesting to see exactly how all these features interplay, but the fact that we had that recurving typhoon, the infantile jet, the Western Pacific, is the large reason why we're getting these really, really enormously large Rossby waves downstream. And it'll be interesting to see how that evolves over time. And obviously, I don't think Jose will really impact the storm terribly much unless it gets very, very close or becomes dominant. But that's probably not going to happen. The models have absolutely no idea what to do with that, of course, as you would expect. I mean, we've seen shifts in the last couple of days of that storm shift 300-500 miles. And so I wouldn't expect that to do a whole lot. But it'd be interesting to see how this season evolves. This seems to me to be more like one of those years back in 50s and 60s where we had, even though we didn't have the amount of satellite observations obviously we do now, and obviously the amount of the data points are different, but it's really interesting to see the seasons like 1960 or you go back and say like even 66 to an extent. You only had a couple really, really big storms in the year, and then you had all the rest of the season was just kind of mad. So that's kind of interesting to see. This year is a little bit different, at least in those terms. But it's kind of weird though how the last several years. We've seen a lot of very weak storms very early on in the year, and there was obviously a lot of concern early that we would go into this 2013 type scenario, which is not terribly infeasible, given that I think the AMO and the thermal hailing circulations definitely starting to change, at least post-mortem 2012, after we lost all that ice in Greenland and the Hadley cell is obviously expanding, so that's creating a lot of changes there. But it'll be interesting to see how the rest of the season evolves. I don't think we're done yet. Unfortunately, after this burst, we're probably going to see more activity. It's just really interesting too, just the fact that we had all those storms early on as well in the Eastern Atlantic. I think a lot of people didn't realize, to get a storm like Brett or like Dawn, obviously it's. Early in the season, it's not terribly easy to begin with, but the fact that we had so many so early on in the Eastern MDR, I think, was sort of a harbinger of things to come. I think if we didn't have an unfavorable long-term background state with the mean sinking center over the Atlantic now and an expanding Hadley cell, I think we would have probably seen much more activity than what we're seeing now. And of course, if this preceding El Nino would have actually produced a response from the Atlantic Meridional thermal hailing circulation, at least something we've more typically seen, in the last century or so records. This past Nino event, if you look at all the other ones, strong or super events, minus 82, 83, obviously for being a volcanic winter. We didn't really see a big spike in the Atlantic MDR sea surface temperatures. We had a really, really strong positive AO and AO, and I think that's also sort of kind of been reverberating down the line a little bit, and it's sort of also contributing at least a little bit to this Hadley cell expansion. But Irma definitely, the conditions were just marginal enough to get it going, and it's taken full advantage of it. I have a question though. So regarding, I guess, the eyewall replacement cycles, what is causing this storm to be so much, I guess, different in terms of how many? I mean, we've seen this is the 6th one in 5 days or so. So I'm really curious to see kind of what are some of the processes going behind the scenes that could be causing this unusual amount of replacements, I guess.
Yeah, it is interesting how frequently they've occurred. I don't know if it's fully ironed out theoretically. I think how storms from genesis to maturity organize internally varies a lot more than we think. The banding structure alone can determine where radii of maximum wind form, and if they're far enough away from the center, often it doesn't matter. If they happen to be at the correct radius, then they can start choking off the eye wall and forming concentric rings instead of bands that only wrap half or 3/4 away around. And this system seemed to come together in a way where the inner core just wasn't consolidated at a stable radius. The first eye was tiny. And right off the bat, when you get a tiny eye like that, you have instability, especially when it's the very first eye wall, because you haven't really expanded angular momentum outward yet. So there's a lot of inertial stability there, and it's pretty easy to get the ERCs started. Why we continue to have 3 more, 4 more after that, I'm not sure I have the answers, but it is very intriguing. It's much faster than normal. The average length of a cycle is about 36 hours, according to Cossen's research. We've seen them happen a lot quicker than that for the last few days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in part just the fact that the circulation has consistently been so small, because every time the eyewall contracted, it contracted to the point to where it was really unstable. And even in Harvey's case, it was a little bit weird how that eyewall evolved. It really never consolidated fully until it practically was up on the Texas coast, and there was localized frictional convergence to tighten the circulation. This system is really, really intriguing. I think the fact that the background environment there, at least MDR, there's still a lot of sinking air and a lot of stable air over the basin, even though the sea surface temperatures are warm, obviously, warmer than normal. I mean, we have one of the wettest Sahels we've seen in the satellite record. I mean, this is the first time we've seen an African easterly wave train that's been more active than normal consistently in the 50 or 60 years. I think that's definitely contributed to at least the size of the storm, and that's partly why we're seeing it get larger. I think that the small size probably contributed at least a little bit of it, because I mean, usually when you get a storm that undergoes eyewall replacement cycles, you need a lot of moisture. You usually need relative humidities, at least 70 to 80%. You obviously need a lot of concentric outer bands. I mean, we saw in Harvey, several hours before it went to landfall, I was thinking, this is going to be like one of those other cases we've seen countless times in the last decade, where we have a really, really large and somewhat disorganized, at least for its, what it could have done, category 1 and 2 hurricane. It comes in, but its circulation there's a lot of dry air in it. It's very disorganized. It's very, broad. I think there was a intrusion of dry air that got into the circulation, and right at the end, all the spiral bands, it had a classic Fibonacci spiral to it, so it was very unstable. And then after that, there was a intrusion of dry air that came off the Texas, Louisiana coast, and I noticed a lot of the bands diffused, and then the eye wall fully contracted and was successful. So that was also really interesting, but there's definitely going to be some interesting research that comes out of Irma, especially regarding these eyewall replacement cycles.
Yeah, I'm just checking the board real quick to see if there are any questions. The main question I've gotten so far is, what's the reason that, anybody have any reasoning for the reason that the GFS ensembles have gone so far west over the last few runs?
Any reasons why the shift west has occurred?
Yeah, mainly the GFS, yeah.
Mostly a southern shift. It seems to be mostly related to the strength of the ridge and the upper level low to the northwest of the storm currently. And you won't always see that just purely on the regular 500 millibar map. Whole depth of the troposphere is kind of necessary to look at that, and the whole ridge is clearly a little stronger on the models, allowing the shift to the south. It's really the only steering feature impacting the storm at the moment as it leaves the influence of the upper low that was to its northeast. There's still a weak one to its northwest. That low was consistently too strong in the models, even up to a couple of days ago. It was still too strong. So now they're finally catching on to how weak that low is, and so the ridge is less weakened by that upper low and is thus stronger. And the details of the wave breaking occurring from that typhoon that Eric mentioned, coming all the way down into North America on a very large scale, that's hard to see. However, that dispersion has been affecting that ridge, could have also been changing on runs to date, but it's kind of difficult to see that without some filtering and fancy analysis. But that ridge, bottom line, has been stronger to the north of the storm on these runs, and that's what's causing the southward shift.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. That's pretty much exactly why. Some of the initial runs, at least in the GFS, the Euro, not so much. The Euro, I mean, obviously the ridge to the north has gotten stronger. The GFS slowed down considerably, at least in the past several days. I mean, you look back runs 4 or 5 days ago, it had the storm trying to already leave the eastern seaboard, and it was going Atlantic Canada as early as late this weekend, Saturday into Sunday and Monday. And so that slowing down definitely has contributed, I think, to some of that, allowing the ridge over the Atlantic to build in at least a little bit more and allow the ridge, obviously, over the Rockies to slide a little bit to the east. But I agree with what Levi said. I think most of the contribution has been from the subtropical ridge to the north, because even when we saw it was coming off of Africa and it was supposed to gain latitude immediately, a lot of the models were not really handling that up-level ridge, terribly well. Part of it may be due to the fact that they're not being able to resolve the core of the storm and how much heat is throwing up into that ridge, and that can, because around the cyclone you have a lot of localized upward motion, but if you're not handling if you're not putting the right amount of heat into the storm, you're going to affect how much sinking air you have surrounding the cyclone, at least in a general sense. There's also, for the most part, especially in the GFS and the Canadian models, there's a general, they have a mid-level height tendency bias, at least from what I know from experience. And so it's really difficult, at least until you get obviously very, very late in the hurricane season, to see those models at least verify being too far east. Usually they're, when you see at least their forecast initially, it's a pretty good idea to often put them on the eastern edge of the guidance envelope and then kind of adjust from there. But interested to see, do you know any reasoning why the models, particularly GFS, has that problem? I've asked a few of my professors around here, haven't really had a straightforward answer with that, I guess.
Yeah, I actually have a colleague, Andy Hazelton, who works at GFDL, and he's working on the new FE3 replacement for GFS, and he's told me that the research they've done up there indicates that the convective primerization in the GFS may be the culprit for breaking down the western periphery of ridges too quickly. And perhaps the size of the vortex in the GFS also plays a role with that, again tied to the convective primerization. And that primerization causes a few problems. This may be just another one of them. It's certainly a bias that, as you said, we've seen in the GFS for many years, really. This recurve / break down the ridge bias. These TCs usually come farther west than the model indicates more often than not. The European, on the other hand, is more consistent. You'll note that the European for days now has had the system near the northern leewards. Took the GFS forever to get it down that far south. It's probably an illustration of that bias.
Okay. Yeah. It'd be interesting to see, obviously because I know of late, it seems like the convective parameterizations, the corrections they made to the model, have almost sort of made it worse, I guess, especially in the short range. At least when we were looking at Harvey, when it was down in the eastern Atlantic, and we had these two competing centers in the monsoon trough. And even, with Cindy, when it was coming out of the monsoon gyre, it had a lot of problems, especially in the short range, of just spinning up these random localized centers of vorticity. in the storm, and then it was just going, obviously a lot of nonlinearity there, so then it was affecting track dramatically downstream. It's just really strange how that's also made it worse. And I've heard a lot of things too, as far as some people weren't really wanting this new model to come out. They were wanting to keep the old one at least for a while before they could, make the parameterizations better. But yeah, it's definitely been an issue, at least especially in the short range. It seems like the parameterizations are even worse.
Yeah, the GFS skill for TCs was degraded in the new model through about day 2, and then it asymptotes to the old GFS skill for longer ranges. But for the short range, it was worse, and for that reason, the NHC voted no on the implementation. But it was statistically a little better with Genesis, so there's a little balance there. But the thing about the new convective parameterization, like you noted with Cindy, a lot of small-scale vorticity spin-up occurs in this model now, usually in environments of large environmental vorticity, so monsoon troughs near Africa, monsoon gyres in Central America, and the East Pac goes nuts now because everything spins up. A lot of this is probably due to the scale-aware convective scheme that has been implemented in the model. And what the current thinking is that the problems are induced because the convective scheme now only kicks in when it thinks it's needed. So the scale of the convection is important. The GFS is a 13-kilometer model, so it can resolve convection on, maybe 30, 50 kilometer scales at minimum. And it will only, the convective scheme will only handle subgrid scale convection. If it thinks that it's not subgrid scale, the convective scheme does not turn on. And so it can allow the model to show explicit convection grid points that can in reality be too strong because the convective scheme is not correcting it, it's not kicking in when it's supposed to. And when that happens, you can get these massive rainfall spikes you'll see in the grids. Andy Penny at NHC was looking at this, and lots of latent heat release, and you'll get this spin up of little lows on almost the grid scale as a result of that erroneous convection, and you'll see that happen. And we actually saw with several of the storms earlier last month in the eastern MDR just spun up way too quick. There was even a run that had like a sub-1,000 millibar tropical cyclone just off of Africa 12 hours before nothing was there. It's been kind of remarkable to see, but it definitely has problems. It is less consistent than the previous iteration.
Yeah.
Yeah, just looking at the board here, just kind of switching gears a little bit. We have one question of how unheard of is it to have a storm that actually formed this far east? I guess a hurricane.
This far east?
Yeah, as far east as it did, yeah.
I mean, we've had a few. Hurricane Julia 2010 was farther east. Hurricane Fred 09 was farther east. I mean, it was pretty far east. It's certainly not unheard of to have majors form this quickly, but it was rather strong for the thermodynamic environment it was in. Just west of Cabo Verde, the SSTs were under 27. I mean, we're talking about 26.5 to 27 degree SSTs. And the ship's model estimated that the maximum potential intensity was only 120 knots. And we actually don't know how strong it got because that eye cleared out quite well for a few hours and a couple of periods there. NHC estimated, I think the highest it got was 105 knots during the period when it was over the cold water. I mean, who knows how strong it actually was? We're going off of satellite estimates. For all we know, it was very close to its MPI at one point there, which in and of itself is fascinating because you don't often get a storm near its MPI. It's pretty hard to do. Things have to be perfect. It may have got there pretty close, and so that is fascinating. I mean, it had low shear, it spun up quick, it had time. What allows one storm to organize quicker than another and approach MPI better than another? That's a lot of good questions. I did notice that the moisture anomalies were pretty high north of the storm relative to Climo, so there was less SAL. Some, but there wasn't a ton. That probably helped. Really the storm just organized early enough that it had a lot of time to kind of work out the kinks and get organized with an inner core, and had all that time these last few days to be organized.
Yeah, it was pretty cool to see even, the European for 8 or 9 days in a row, every run, I think, except one, picked up on this wave before it even, formed. And eventually the GFS caught on, but it was amazing to see how they were able to pick up on this vortex. It was over like Chad. It was 6 days away from emerging on the coast, and eventually it actually happened. I know there is an MGO pulse, or at least there's a low frequency state that's kind of sort of become ingrained, at least in the Indian Ocean. That's definitely contributed to increasing a lot of the instability in the African easterly jet. And we recently had a kelp wave passage, probably about a week and a half ago. And that, I mean, even after the kelp wave passes and you get the suppressive phase, and this is one of the issues I had with some of the claims that we weren't going to see, a hurricane, in X period of time, mid-September. Because even after the suppressive wave gets there, the moisture fluxes were still really high for at least a week and a half after the favorable wave is gone. You have favorable upper level easterly, anomalous shear, which again, is against the climatological background state up to about 30 to 40 west. And of course, we're kind of in a background environment that's also relatively, at least marginal, for tropical cyclone genesis, at least in the eastern NDR. As we saw, we had 3 storms. We had TD4, Brett, and Dawn in the eastern Atlantic. I think what's more unusual about this storm, rather than where it formed, is like where is more so why it tracked to the west-southwest for such a long period of time and to the degree it did. There's only been a handful of storms that have ever done that in the HERDAT record, and of those, I mean, most of them came off of the African coast, and they were tropical depressions, or they weren't really, they were poorly sampled. And this is, a lot of them were before the Sally record, and you see they had west-southwest movements, but they weren't terribly significant. But this one is very unusual in that it's maintained this motion for so long. I mean, you have to go back, of course, everyone remembers Ike when it did that, but it was much further west in the Atlantic. The only case I really saw that was somewhat feasible, at least going back in the record, is a Fort Lauderdale hurricane of 47. There was at least a south of west due south of west motion for a few days. That was pretty interesting to see, but I think that's more anomalous more than anything, and it's probably indicative, again, of a really strong tropical ridge, and obviously there's more questions there, and a lot of people, of course, had issues come up with Harvey in that they were asking, well, is the ridge over the Rockies blocking Harvey? Are those becoming increasingly common? And how you model that. So there's a lot of interesting questions, but I think that's the one thing that grabs my attention more than anything. And when you look at the storms that do that, so you have Ike, you have, I think, Luis 95 technically had this west-southwest motion, Bill in 09, but again, it was, a tropical depression. And of those storms, and you compare it to the climatology, the chances, I mean, even though the sample size is pretty small, you can at least say that, if a storm moving from where Irma was before it made the turn to where it is now, after it's starting to finally turn back to the west and northwest in the climatological direction, the odds have increased, have at least more than doubled compared to climatology. So that was definitely another really interesting part I found about this. There's definitely going to be a lot of research obviously done after this storm is long gone, and we're definitely a long ways from over with it.
All right. The next question I have is from Larry on our board. He asks, let me find it. If the current the GFS ensembles are using the newest version of the operational GFS, he says, I recall lags in the past regarding the GFS ensembles getting updated, meaning the ensembles are being based on the older version.
I'm not sure I heard the question clearly. I don't know if Eric did.
All right, hold on. I'm sorry. Let's see. He's asking, basically, are the GFS ensembles using the old or the new version of the operational? He says apparently there used to be a lag.
It's not entirely clear to me. I and some others were wondering about this. Would there be any actual change to the ensemble system when the operational was updated? To my understanding, there was no change made. Perturbations to the GEFS can be either in initial conditions or model physics, I believe there are model physics perturbations. I'm not 100% sure, but I think there are. So technically, if there are physics perturbations, they could be affected by any physics changes made to the operational model, aka the convective scheme, perhaps. But as far as regular perturbations like initial conditions, just uncertainty in what is the atmosphere looking like right now, those theoretically shouldn't be any different because the dynamical core and all the physics of the ensemble changed. The one change we did see when it was upgraded was there was a little bit of a bug with the sea surface temperature because the GFS operational in this update now includes a diurnal SST cycle so that it gets warmer in the afternoon and then cooler at night. The SST does. That gets assimilated into the ensemble, but instead of varying diurnally like it was supposed to, it would start at a given point in the day and then remain constant for the whole run. So you'd have the 18Z GEFS with abnormally warm subtropical Atlantic SSTs from the afternoon persisting for the entire run. Aggregating that over several days gives you giant changes in the global circulation and a ton of local effects. And even with Irma, this is still true, by the way. The 18Z GEFS is crazy compared to the other cycles. It really shouldn't be used. For Irma, it had an ensemble mean 916 millibar pressure on an 18Z run, which is absurd for the model's resolution. It's beyond anything I'd ever seen just because of the water temperature changes. And it also changes the track because it influences the strength of the ridge once you integrate out to a week in advance. So this is still a problem that's ongoing. It's something that I believe has been fixed internally. They figured out how to make the SST vary correctly, but the fix has not been pushed to production just yet.
And another question is regarding the G4 mission today. Is it just in the Atlantic or was it across the United States and in the Pacific?
It was Atlantic. They flew north of the Eastern Caribbean and a loop around Hurricane Irma, trying to sample the ridge that we were talking about to its north that's pushing it west. That seems to be what they wanted to sample. I mean, we get enough sounding data over the continent that we don't need the plane to fly over the continent or anything like that. We have all the data that we need there. Satellite data accounts for 80 to 90% of what the models assimilate anyway. The drop sounds are really useful in regions where there's a lot of sensitivity, and especially for the Greater Antilles right now, we're worried about mile track shifts here if we're talking about direct hits with Puerto Rico or any of these smaller islands. So the sensitivity is really in that ridge in the short term, and so that's what they decided they wanted to sample today.
All right, hold on.
Yeah, and there's not really a whole lot you can do, at least in that case, because the trough that's the long wave that's going to be at least over New England in a week or so is already over just south of the Hudson Bay. The shore, I mean, technically, I think the only feature that would really be, I guess, useful is not in the North American Upper Air Network. I haven't checked exactly where the shore wave is, but I don't think it's at least gotten to the west coast of North America yet, the one that's going to dive in and reinforce the upper level low over the mid-south. So I think that's about the only feature I think would be worth monitoring. But even now, I think within the next 48 hours, it's going to be moving on shore. So we'll have that at least partially sampled. So that'll definitely help the guidance out. But there's not really a whole lot you can really do in that case.
Another question is, if this does interact with the islands, how much would that change the track, and what kind of a change in the track would it make?
Well, there's a lot of stuff that can occur when a hurricane gets entangled with the Greater Antilles. Of course, it would weaken significantly if it spent any amount of time with the inner core near the mountains. That's, of course, very bad if that were to happen for those islands themselves. But as far as downstream impacts, as Eric alluded to earlier, the track can get jerked around a little bit because of the vortex interaction with mountains. You imagine the storm butting up against these, up to 13,000 foot tall mountains in Hispaniola, for instance. And you can see the track make some wobbles. We saw some of this with storms like Hurricane David in 1979, where kind of a jerky track over Hispaniola before emerging on the other side. So you could envision little changes, and in this kind of a pattern, those little changes could lead to larger track changes afterwards. So if you, for example, push the storm onto the southern side of Cuba instead of the northern side due to an interaction with the mountains there, then it could mean the difference between a storm that goes up the eastern seaboard and a storm that goes into the Gulf of Mexico, just because of some of the fragility that we're dealing with in the steering flow. Facts in terms of, say, the intensity of the storm, I'm not entirely sure how that would work here. The vortex remains pretty deep for a long time. Even if you put it over land, it takes a while to spin down in the upper levels. So in terms of, weaker storm, is that different than a stronger storm? I'm not sure we can really tell if there would be a difference there. You might just watch for how long it stays entangled with the terrain before the terrain lets it go, if you will.
Yeah, with regards to, I guess, intensification after, if it were to interact with the islands, particularly what you see, historically speaking, we saw with Ike, and even to an extent Matthew, that when they interact with the islands, especially when they're, category 4 or 5 hurricanes like we saw in David in '79, it still had a lot of time, I guess, over water after that, or even Ike in '08. And it interacted with a small sliver of Cuba, and it never really recovered. And what you'll often see after a storm interacts with land like that is it doesn't come out the other side. It doesn't really take full advantage of its environment. It just becomes very long, very large, and broad. It doesn't really get back to its full strength. So if we were to see that, given where Irma is now, and it may become a Category 5, just given what's been going on. If it were to, say, slam right into Hispaniola and go over Cuba, I would imagine even if it had all the time in the world on the other side, it probably would not intensify, at least to the degree, because there would still be some remnant core left of the storm. And so that would definitely, I guess, have an impact on its future reorganization, and that would probably slow things down a bit. That's usually...
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So I guess we've taken up a good 50 minutes of you guys' time today. So I'll let everybody go at this point. You guys have any closing thoughts on anything right now?
I just say, being prepared is the best thing anyone can do if you live in an area that could be affected by the hurricane. It's really, people forget, we learned with Harvey, water is the biggest threat. If you live on the coastline or anywhere near an area that's prone to surge, it's kind of a big deal. If the hurricane's shown within a couple of days to be near your area, once we have more certainty and the Hurricane Center shows a track that is somewhere over a surge-prone area, it's something to take really seriously. Hopefully, the lessons from Harvey, as tragic as they were, will apply here. Hasn't been that long yet, and we may have to deal with another one. So do be prepared, would be my message to people. You don't want to take this kind of thing lightly.
Yeah, you don't want to focus on the center of the track. You want to look at the whole large-scale environment, and it's a Category 4 hurricane, and it's probably going to go through a lot of structural changes. And even if it weakens, if it does strike, say, anywhere north of Florida, it's probably going, will at some point. So don't focus on the track, but the impacts will extend far away from the center, especially, again, if it's going to go into tropical transition. And get prepared early. Because as we saw with Matthew, and now we're starting to see in Florida, you're having a lot of shortages on supplies of, water and, other commodities, and you don't want that to happen to you, and you don't want to be left in the dust and not have anything, to get ready for. So I would definitely prepare as early as you can. I definitely think, obviously, in Florida, you have a disaster declaration there, so definitely get ready. But if you're in, say, the Carolinas or further north, obviously you should be, thinking about executing your hurricane plan, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to get prepared. But still, I think it's a little early for anybody. I'd say north of Florida, pretty much at this point.
Chris, do you have anything? I see you having me on there.
Man, I'm so sorry, you guys. It's been a long day. Sorry, I thought it was on mute, and as soon as I turned it on, I saw that it was on mute, and I was like, well, at least let me listen to what's going on. So
yeah, I muted you because you were
I'm sorry, man. It's been a long ride from Florida, and I can tell you, to elaborate on that real quick, we're down at my parents' house down in South Florida, and it was amazing to see the scramble for propane and for waters, and it was crazy, because I went out with my parents before we left to try to find some propane and some stuff, and every gas station was completely out. So that's the biggest thing. But definitely sorry, you guys. You probably heard it's a long ride home back up to Georgia, so I apologize for the background noise. But yeah, I think this is going to be an interesting one, by far. And Levi, just for you, kudos to you and thank you for everything you do on that site, man. I was like between my phone and the tablet this weekend, and hanging out with my family. It was on your site, so I commend you and certainly thank you for that great work too.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Same here. I really like the site. It's usually my go-to anytime I'm using model guidance. Even the analog page, I usually keep up with that periodically, and it's awesome. It's probably the most user-friendly site I know of out there, and I highly recommend it to all my friends and family who aren't as familiar with weather. I usually say if you want to look at, say, the model guidance, I usually direct them, I guess, to your site. So.
Well, you're very kind. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't know,
To
man.
echo everybody, thanks for everything, Levi. We love the site. Thanks for dropping by tonight. It's awesome to have you here. Chris, do you have something?
I was just gonna I know I missed the entire thing, so again, I apologize. But I'm kind of curious to see how far she can get west before she starts to turn. We all know the turn's coming at some point, but how far does she, like you're saying on the forum, quote unquote, buries herself down there above the islands? So, Webb, you brought a great point, and I know we've talked about it as well. We're not talking about some big trough we usually see coming in to sweep this out and hooking it way out to sea, and I'm sure you guys have talked about that. So, I don't know, man. And Florida is Florida, so Florida's not going to really knock this thing down too much if it rides the entire spine all the way up either.
Yeah. And one thing to note too is even if the circulation starts getting pulled north, obviously it weakens a little bit. We saw this even. I'm going to reference Isaac again. All the models consistently were way too far east with that storm, and they even had the intensity right to at least a degree. But I think the frictional convergence, at least right along the coast of Cuba, is relatively flat land. So it wouldn't really totally disrupt the circulation too much. It would definitely weaken a really powerful hurricane like Irma. That could possibly create some drag on the circulation. And that would be interesting to see if the models are properly handling that as well. But that will probably eventually it's going to get turned north, obviously, into this weakness because there's a big, like Levi said, in his video, we have a big ridge over to Texas and into the southwest. We have a ridge, obviously, to the east over the Azores and Bermuda. So it's going to come up somewhere between the central Gulf Coast and just offshore the eastern seaboard. Just not sure where yet. So that'll definitely be interesting to see how this evolves next couple of days.
Yeah, since that's the case, hopefully we can get you guys back for another show later in the week. Levi, I know you're probably busy, and Webb, I know you're over being Wayne Gretzky and everything. So I don't know how much time you guys have, but we'll be in touch with you guys to see if we can do this again later in the week if you guys don't mind. Yeah,
sure. I know it's a big deal to everybody, and I know obviously how impactful even a small, a little system like this can be in large scale. So definitely be worth my time, especially because I've been bothering my professors about it, especially Dr. Lackman here for the past week, and Gary, I bothered him. He called this storm. He said it was Hurricane Eric because I kept talking about it incessantly, and then eventually it became a more serious issue, and it's been kind of fun to see how that's been going on. But definitely be interesting to see how this evolves. And I've been keeping tabs on how much ACE it's been piling up. If it follows NHC forecast verbatim, say the next 5 days, it's going to be well inside the top 20 in terms of all time. It's going to exceed 50 points. If it were to say, if this upper level low wasn't there and this just had that trough off the eastern seaboard and just meandered off the southeast coast, this could have easily gotten really close to the record ACE. So it still could get really, really high, but I'm not sure if we're going to be able to beat Ivan or San Siriaco. But we're definitely going to make a run at it, I think, especially if this becomes a Cat 5 or strong upper end 4 for a long period of time.
I agree.
All right, guys. Appreciate the time tonight. Like I said, we'll be in touch. Thanks for stopping by, Eric. Weber Weather 53 on the message boards. What's your Twitter? Go ahead and name drop real quick so people can follow you.
Yeah, it's Weber Weather 53. Yep.
And then Levi Cowan from tropicaltidbits.com. Great site. Stop by if you haven't seen it yet. I know that, it's a busy time for him. If you want to throw a little bit of change his way to donate, I know there's a link on there. Feel free to do it. We're be more than happy to contribute from our site to yours, because I know so many of our members use your site, and we
tap a
lot of your bandwidth with 800 people here. So, we're taking our own donations. Maybe we can donate some of our donations your way.
Well, you guys are very kind, and I really appreciate you guys having me on tonight.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Thanks for taking the time.
Again, we appreciate you being here. Hopefully we can do it again. Thanks, everybody. Hopefully we can avoid this somehow, but you never know. And have a good night, and we will probably be back later in the week for Irma special number 2. So have a great night, folks.
All right. Thank you.